Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. Turn off your cell phones, please. Thank you. We have a very busy schedule coming up with programs and partnership programs. For example, tonight and tomorrow night at 6 p.m., Ron Scott and the YWCA are sponsoring the Human Library, where you get to come and check out human beings and talk to them for 10 minutes. So that's tonight and tomorrow night. Now Thursday is our cooking class, part of the People's University Appalachian Crafts. The Vagabond Chef, Matt, will be here. And soup beans are the topic for the first one. And apple something cake is the dessert next week. If you registered, that's great. You get a free food sample. If you didn't register, you can still attend. You just don't get a free food sample. So, next Monday, the Symphony is 95 years old, Wheeling Symphony, and they'll have a panel discussion of three Wheeling musical legends. The Symphony Maestro, Devlin, will be here. Sonia Toms, who's the executive director, and our old friend Aaron Rothenbuehler, who will talk about Everett Lee. So that's Monday at noon. Next Tuesday, the Wheeling Poetry Series continues with Mark Harshman welcoming Rachel Peckham and Sarah Henning, both of whom are professors at Marshall University. Our old friend Jon-Erik Gilot. He's an archivist and the author of the book John Brown's Raid, Harper's Ferry, and the Coming of the Civil War, October 1618, 1859, part of the Emerging Civil War series. He's written numerous published articles on Civil War topics, including one for the soon-to-be-published fall 2024 Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review. More on that next week. So please welcome back Jon-Erik Gilot.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me back. It's appropriate to be here today talking about this topic because some of the events that we're going to be talking about were happening 165 years ago tomorrow. And then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we'd be celebrating the 165th anniversary of these events. So we're going to try to take John Brown from the cradle to the grave in about 40 minutes here. So we're going to be moving quickly. I'll take any questions at the end, and I'd be happy to sell you a book. But you know, John Brown, he's one of these characters that evokes a lot of emotion from people, even today, nearly 165 years after his death. He can be appropriated by multiple sides of the same argument. He can be looked at as a hero, a villain, a madman, a saint, a martyr, a terrorist. That's a lot to unpack about this guy, so let's look at who was John Brown. Well, Brown was born in Torrington, Connecticut in May 1800 to devout Calvinist parents. Now, one of the tenets of Calvinism is the belief in divine predestination, that God has predetermined your purpose in life, who you are going to be in the world. So when John Brown tells us later in life that he believes he is God's instrument on earth to destroy slavery, he truly believed that. His father, Owen Brown, was an abolitionist also who moves the family west to Ohio in 1805 up to northeastern Ohio. He founds the Western Reserve Anti-Slavery Society. He founds a church dedicated to anti-slavery activism. He is an early trustee at Oberlin College. So, John Brown is brought up in this kind of atmosphere. He comes about his beliefs honestly in freedom and equality and things that we might take for granted today, but what were really radical ideas 200 years ago. As a young man, Brown witnesses on one of his trips. His father was a tanner by trade, and Brown worked during the War of 1812 delivering tanned leather and hides to the United States Army outposts. And on one of these trips, Brown witnesses a young slave nearly his same age who is lodged outside in cold weather, who is poorly clothed, who is beaten by his master with anything that came to hand. And Brown says it's this singular event that galvanizes him into a most determined abolitionist and swear an eternal war against slavery. Now, in 1837, Elijah P. Lovejoy, he was an abolitionist printer in Alton, Illinois. He is murdered by a group of pro-slavery, like a pro-slavery posse that comes into Alton. They dump his printing press into the Mississippi River. This is a big deal at this time. This makes news all over the country. John Brown gets word about this, and he is enraged. He rises up during a church service in Hudson, Ohio, and he declares that, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." And he would truly make it his life's work. Now, it's become, fashionable, more so in recent times. So, what do we know about John Brown besides John Brown's raid? Most people know him as a failure, as a poor businessman, that he went bankrupt several times. In 1990, when Ken Burns released the Civil War series on PBS, 44 million people tune in to watch it. It's the most watched television program up to that point in United States history. But what do we hear? In the very first episode, we hear historian Ed Bars tell us that John Brown is important for only one thing: the failure in everything in life. We hear historian and narrator David McCullough tell us that Brown was an inept businessman who had failed 20 times in 6 states, who had defaulted on his loans. Now, yes, Brown has a string of what have become highly publicized business failures earlier in life. He may not have been a great businessman, but this is emblematic of a time of great financial volatility in the United States. Today, borrowers and lenders, we enjoy many more safety nets than you had in the early to mid-19th century. So, you had devastating financial panics in 1819, 1837, and 1857 that ruined many John Browns of that era. But Brown does gain some renown in this time in the field. He becomes well regarded as a grader of wool, sheep's wool. And you know what? We had a lot of wool growers in this area, particularly just a little bit north of here in Brooke County, across the river in Jefferson County, and then just across the state line in Washington County, Pennsylvania. You had a lot of merino sheep being raised in this area, and John Brown was a big fan of merino wool. So Brown was well known in this area. He would travel around southeastern Ohio, the northern panhandle, and the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania, working with farmers on grading their wool and finding a market for their product. We know that he visited Alexander Campbell's house in Bethany. He was a regular visitor in West Middletown in Washington County, Pennsylvania. In 1847, there was a Wool Growers Association in Steubenville where John Brown was one of the featured speakers. So, he's well known and well regarded in this area prior to, the events that we've come to know about John Brown. He remains in the wool business until he finally divests in 1854. But in spite of these business reverses, Brown keeps that anti-slavery focus throughout his life. When he moves to Springfield, Massachusetts, he founds the League of Gileadites. This is a militant organization aimed at protecting the local African-American community from slave catchers. So here you see Brown becoming more militant. This is a time when most abolitionists are trying to change public hearts and minds by words. John Brown was a man of action. He's becoming more militant here. For a man of seemingly perpetual limited means, Brown was always broke, never had any money. He ran in prominent circles. He made the acquaintance of Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, William Lloyd Garrison. In the late 1840s, he moves his family north up into the Adirondack Mountains in New York to help launch a colony there for freed African Americans and for escaped slaves. But by the mid-1850s, we have seen decades and decades of compromise after compromise relating to slavery in the United States. And by the mid-1850s, things are reaching a boiling point. So Congress essentially abdicates its duties in 1854 in passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act calls for popular sovereignty, or that the residents of the territories of Kansas and Nebraska should be allowed to decide for themselves if these territories would be allowed to enter the Union as slave states or free. This was going to threaten to topple that delicate balance of power that all of these compromises had worked out up to that point. Now, slaveholders essentially ceded Nebraska. This is going to be a slave state. We're not going to fight over this. But Kansas, this is where they draw a line in the sand. This is where slaveholders are ready to fight. So you have both abolitionists called Jayhawkers and pro-slavery factions called Border Ruffians who rush out to Kansas to stake their claim and tip the balance of power in their respective favor. Now, several of Brown's own children leave from New York and Ohio and go west to Kansas in 1855. And on getting out there, they are immediately identified as abolitionists. They write home to their father that they had been marked for destruction and that their cause was so bleak that they needed guns more than they needed bread. So they were in a desperate situation. So Brown hears from his children. He moves west to Kansas in late 1855, where during a period known as Bleeding Kansas, he openly battles pro-slavery militants who were determined to see Kansas admitted to the Union as a slave state. On May 21st, 1856, the Free Soil or Free State stronghold at Lawrence, Kansas, is sacked and burned by pro-slavery border ruffians, by a posse that comes into town. John Brown is enraged. This is more than he is willing to stand. 3 days later, he puts together a group of 6 men, including several of his sons. He goes to Pottawatomie in Kansas. He kidnaps and orders the execution of 5 pro-slavery men there along Pottawatomie Creek, invoking one of his favorite Bible passages, which is Hebrews 9:22. Quote, "Almost all things are by the law purged with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no remission." Now, these killings usher in, and these were brutal killings. They hacked these men to death with broadswords. But these usher in the deadliest period of the Bleeding Kansas conflict, this run-up to the Civil War, in which 29 men are killed in the 3 months following Pottawatomie Creek. That's nearly 4 times the number killed over the previous 2 years. So things are really heating up here. Brown leaves Kansas later that month. He has a bounty on his head. He's a wanted man. But he says, quote, "I have only a short time left to live, only one death to die, and I shall die fighting for this cause. There will be no more peace in this land until slavery is done. I will give them something to do other than extend slavery into the territories. I will carry this war into Africa." By that he means the slave-holding South. Now, he spends the next few years crisscrossing northern states, gathering money, arms, equipment, men for this war against slavery that he has planned. He actually returns out to Kansas in late 1858. He raids into Missouri. He liberates 11 slaves there, transports them all the way to Detroit and on to Canada, about 1,000 miles north. Along the way, they reach Holton, Kansas, and there's a pro-slavery posse that comes they're trying to capture Brown. They're trying to recapture these escaped slaves, and Brown arms the slaves that were with him. They turn, they fight, and they defeat this posse. It's called the Battle of Holton, or the Battle of the Spurs. Brown captures the horses from this posse, and he auctions them along his trip north. But here Brown sees that he can raid into a slave state, that he can liberate these slaves, that he can carry them north into freedom, that he can arm these slaves, and that they would be willing to fight for their own freedom. So he's starting to get the idea here that this can work. This can perhaps work on a larger scale. Now, because we're short on time here, and I want to talk about some of our local connections, some of the local reactions to John Brown's raid, we're going to skip ahead, and we're going to ask, why Harper's Ferry? How is it that John Brown landed on this seemingly sleepy corner of Virginia? I don't know how many of you have been to Harper's Ferry. I'd rather be in Harper's Ferry than just about anywhere on earth. It's my favorite place. I was there last week. I got to hike up on the mountain that you see there. I love it there. But it's located at the confluence of the Potomac and the Shenandoah Rivers. Founded in 1763, for decades it had attracted both visitors, sightseers, and settlers to this area for its water power, for its natural resources, and just for its sheer beauty. Thomas Jefferson visits Harper's Ferry, and he says the view there is worth a voyage across the Atlantic, that it's one of the most stupendous views in nature. one of two national armories that were established after the Revolutionary War in 1790. One of them was located here at Harper's Ferry, the other in Springfield, Massachusetts. Harper's Ferry, by the time of John Brown's raid, it sports an armory, a rifle works, and an arsenal with about 100,000 weapons stored there. As a transportation hub, you have the Shenandoah Canal, the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Winchester and Potomac Railroad, all converging on this little spit of land there between the rivers. And John Brown is already familiar with this area. About 20 years prior to the raid, he had surveyed land there for Oberlin College. He later admits that he spent most of that time actually looking at this land as a way to funnel slaves north to freedom through the Cumberland Valley and north into Pennsylvania. Harper's Ferry sits only about 40 miles south of the Pennsylvania line. But Brown also saw this area, these mountains, as full of natural defensible points where he could leverage terrain and fewer men to his advantage. So he envisioned what he called lightning raids, or that he would fall on a farm or plantation overnight, steal away with their slaves back into the mountains, and shuttle them north to freedom. He thought that he could make it untenable for slaveholders to keep their slaves in that area of the Upper South for fear of losing their investment in those slaves to Brown, a form of economic warfare, if you will, that if he could drive slavery from one county in Virginia, that he could weaken the institution of slavery throughout the state of Virginia and thereby weaken it throughout the South, that he could drive that line of demarcation between free states and slave states south of the Mason-Dixon line. Again, invoking scripture here, that Brown was prepared to, quote, break the jaws of the wicked and pluck the spoils out of his teeth. It's only later in 1859 that Brown, his plan evolves from these lightning raids to actually taking and holding Harper's Ferry. He thought his presence there would serve as a rallying cry for slaves in the neighborhood to flock to him, and that if he were to take some prominent hostages in town, that he could use them to dictate his terms of egress out back into the mountains, and that he could exchange those hostages for slaves. He thought that he could dictate his terms from a position of authority. And if any of you have been to Lower Town Harper's Ferry, you are surrounded by water, you are surrounded by bridges, you are surrounded by mountains. If you are in Lower Town Harper's Ferry, from a military standpoint, you are not operating from any terms of authority, which Brown will find out. But there were many slaves in this area. There were about 4,000 slaves in Jefferson County, where Harper's Ferry is located, about 300 slaves in Harper's Ferry proper, or about 300 African Americans in Harper's Ferry proper, divided evenly between enslaved and free. But you also had about 21,000 slaves in the counties immediately surrounding Harper's Ferry. So he had a big pool here on which he could draw. But Brown, or he was using an alias by this time, he was going by Isaac Smith. He arrives in the Harper's Ferry neighborhood in July 1859. He rents a farmhouse about 5 miles across the river in Washington County, Maryland, known as the Kennedy Farmhouse. It is still there today. You could go see it. It's a historic site. There is some interpretation there as well, but it's a very small house. It sits back away from the road, away from any prying eyes. This was going to be a good place to hide his growing army. So Brown's men gather at the Kennedy Farmhouse during the summer and early autumn of 1859. His army would amount to only 21 men. This includes 16 white men and 5 African American. His daughter, Annie, who you see here, she also comes to the Kennedy Farmhouse during the summer of 1859, along with Brown's daughter-in-law, Martha. They are going to keep house, but more so they're going to keep up appearances so that it wasn't a bunch of men congregating at this house. Annie remains her father's fiercest defender for the rest of her life, and she leaves us an amazing account of what life was like at the Kennedy Farmhouse in the run-up to John Brown's raid. We have a wealth of information and accounts to draw on, but she also tells us that her time there at the Kennedy Farmhouse with these men was something like standing on a powder keg after a slow match had been lit. You could tell things were maybe going to go sideways here. But Brown gathers his men here at the farmhouse without them knowing his intention of, like we talked about, taking and holding Harper's Ferry, of sacking the town. He does not unpack this to them until August of 1859, just a few months prior to the raid. And it doesn't go over well. The men are split. One of them is actually, there's a near mutiny. He gets so upset, he leaves the Kennedy farmhouse. He's gone for a week before he cools down and comes back. Brown is despondent. He offers to resign, let the men decide for themselves what they want to do. So they put it to a vote. They get together, and they decide they're going to stick it out with John Brown. They say that they're going to go along with his plan, quote, until he proves incompetent. So John Brown, for all of his faults, I do think he was a leader of men. But by the fall of 1859, Brown is running out of money. It's becoming clear that his army wasn't going to grow any larger, that the longer he waited, the greater the risk of his plan being exposed. So 165 years ago tomorrow evening, October 16th, 1859, Brown calls out to his men, "Men, get on your arms. We will proceed to the ferry." So they begin, he puts his army on the road to Harper's Ferry, ultimately on the road to destiny. They begin what's described as a march as solemn as a funeral procession. It's raining, the men are wearing ponchos, they've got their hats pulled down over their heads, they're holding their rifles under their ponchos. The men get to Harper's Ferry. They cut the telegraph wires leading out of town. They capture the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge here leading into town. And then they start to fan out for their major objectives. They capture the United States Armory, the United States Arsenal, some 100,000 weapons stored there. They move about a mile outside of town up here, and they capture the rifle works on Virginius Island. They send other men here to watch the bridge over the Shenandoah River. Things are going well for John Brown. Brown also sends a squad of men out into the countryside to begin taking hostages and liberating slaves. One of the hostages would include this gentleman here. It's Colonel Lewis Washington. He was a prominent farmer. He was a militia officer, well-regarded, highly respected. He was also the great-grandnephew of the first president, George Washington. They take him as a hostage. They liberate his slaves. They also take several prized Washington family relics, a pistol and a sword, that are presented to John Brown. They move on after this to a neighbor's house, John Allstadt. They take Allstadt, his son, as hostages. They liberate Allstadt's slaves, and they start heading back towards Harper's Ferry. So by midnight, John Brown had pulled off quite the coup. They had secured all of their targets. They had captured several hostages. They had liberated several more slaves. Things are going very well for John Brown at this point. Things change shortly afterwards. Around 1:30 a.m. the following morning, a Baltimore and Ohio Express train traveling from Wheeling to Baltimore pulls into Harper's Ferry. The conductor is confused why there is no bridge watchman there to meet him. Now, this was a covered, and this is a later image here, so this isn't a great image to use for this, but it was a covered bridge, railroad bridge in town there. So as a train would pull in, it would slow. There would be a bridge watchman who would come out and tell the conductor, there's no obstructions on the track. It's clear to go through. And then there's about a 90-degree turn on the other side of the track. So trains would slow. They would slowly go through the track, make that turn, and then resume their speed. But there's no one here to meet the train. So the conductor doesn't know what's going on. He comes out. The bridge watchman runs up. He said, I was at my post on the bridge. There's a group of men here, highway robbers. They came and attacked me. I'm not sure what's going on. So the conductor, the bridge watchman, and the B&O baggage master, a guy by the name of Hayward Shepard, they cautiously enter the bridge, where they find several of Brown's men stationed there. Shots ring out from Brown's men. The railroad crew turns and runs, and Hayward Shepard is struck in the back. He is mortally wounded. The first casualty of John Brown's war to end slavery was himself a free African American. So local citizens of Harper's Ferry, nearby Bolivar, the town right above Harper's Ferry. They start to gather to see what's going on. They're waking up to this gunfire. Some of the armory and arsenal workers are reporting to work, and they're taken as hostage. They don't know who these men are in this town. They don't know what's going on. One local doctor who you see here, a guy by the name of John Starry, he realizes what's going on, and he starts his own kind of Paul Revere's ride out to the neighboring towns, to Charlestown and Shepherdstown, to put the militias on notice that something is wrong at Harper's Ferry. We need some help down here. So by sunrise on October 17th, Brown allows that Baltimore and Ohio train to leave. He actually tried to get them to leave overnight. The conductor refused. He thought the bridge might be booby-trapped, that the train would plummet down into the river. So that conductor waits until morning on October 17th. But this train from Wheeling, ultimately ensures John Brown's downfall, because as soon as he gets out of town, he stops and tries to get a telegraph off to Baltimore, to the B&O offices at Baltimore, but the lines are cut. So he keeps stopping at different stops, can't get a telegraph through until he gets up to Monocacy Junction, around Frederick, Maryland. And there he gets a telegram to John Garrett, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, telling him that there was a slave insurrection going on at Harper's Ferry. Garrett receives the telegraph, says, surely this is being exaggerated. Wires that back to the conductor, and the conductor says, no, I have not made it out to be nearly half as bad as it actually is. So Garrett wires to the White House, to President Buchanan, and now word is out beyond the immediate area around Harper's Ferry of this supposed insurrection. The militia in Martinsburg, actually, they try to get a telegram also over to Baltimore, letting them know, hey, we're on our way to the scene of the action there. What do you want us to do? They can't get the telegraph to go through. The lines have been cut. So the Martinsburg militia wire all the way over here to Wheeling and have that message routed from Wheeling up to Pittsburgh and down to Baltimore. So the first that Wheeling actually hears about John Brown's raid isn't even for them. It's not their information. They're just passing it along. The first Wheeling hears about it for our own information is 11:30 a.m. on October 17th, when the Baltimore and Ohio offices wire here to Wheeling that rioters had taken possession of the railroad at Harper's Ferry, but the matters were likely exaggerated, so don't delay any trains and don't leak word of this to the press. We don't want this to hurt our stock, essentially. While all of this is going on, citizens begin trading fire with Brown's men, small pockets of citizens with their own arms and ammunition. Several civilians are killed at this point. Things really begin to escalate, and the militias begin arriving from Charlestown and Shepherdstown and Martinsburg. The militia that afternoon, they organize kind of a multi-pronged assault on Brown's men here. So you have the Jefferson Guards were the militia from Charlestown. They cross over the Potomac River about a mile above town. They come down the C&O Canal towpath here, and they come across the Baltimore and Ohio Bridge. You have other local citizens who cross over the Shenandoah River and begin hemming Brown's men in from the Shenandoah Bridge. Men from Bolivar, right up above Harper's Ferry, they go and they attack Hall's Rifle Works. The Shepherdstown militia move down High Street, and the Martinsburg militia kind of leapfrog down the Armory Yard. So John Brown begins losing his foothold here during this time. With the militia coming across the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Bridge, that cuts off Brown's line of retreat to the north. Brown left a cache of weapons in Maryland. He left several men in Maryland, and now he is cut off from them. So the noose is beginning to tighten here. Now, Brown realizes this coordinated assault is going on, so he calls in some of his outposts to meet there at the Armory Yard and drive back this assault. So several men come from the arsenal, including Dangerfield Newby. I've done a presentation here about Newby before. Newby was from Bridgeport, Ohio, just across the river. He's stationed at the arsenal. He moves over, helps repel this assault from across the bridge. So while they beat back the militia from the bridge, they don't leave the bridge itself. They just retreat back into it. So Brown's line of retreat is cut. But Newby's involved in that assault. On running back across the street to his post at the arsenal, Newby is struck by a shot to the abdomen, manages to return gunfire. He's struck a second time with a small iron spike that is fired from the building of a nearby window, strikes Newby in the neck, cutting his throat, quote, from ear to ear. The civilians around Harper's Ferry, remember, Brown's men had possession of the armory, the arsenal, the rifle works. They had kind of the ammunition that was available in town. So these civilians are fighting back with whatever they can throw at John Brown's men, including, loading a spike into one of their guns, which struck Newby in the neck. When word reaches back here to the Upper Ohio Valley that one of our own had been involved in John Brown's raid, 3 men grabbed Dangerfield's brother, Gabriel Newby, and they nearly beat him to death on the streets of Bridgeport, Ohio. So at this point, Brown begins trying to negotiate an exit from town, proposing that, allow me a head start and then you can chase after me. The militia were not in any mood to negotiate. These men were getting angrier as the hours went by. The bars are still serving these men alcohol throughout the day. They're getting more belligerent as the day goes on. More militia arrive later in the day, retaking much of the armory yard, further hemming Brown's men into the engine house proper, the John Brown's fort as we know it today. That was kind of his Alamo. That's where Brown was holed up with several men from his command and his hostages. But like we said, John Brown's footprint is rapidly shrinking at this point. Harper's Ferry's mayor, Fontaine Beckham, was observing the fighting here. He was carrying a railroad lantern. He is struck and killed by one of Brown's men. Beckham was highly regarded in town. If any of you remember Mr. Fontaine Beckham Huff, he was the longtime president of Contractor Supply Services here in Wheeling. He was named after his great-grandfather, Fontaine Beckham, the mayor of Harper's Ferry, killed during John Brown's raid. The Huff family, they still have the lantern that Fontaine Beckham was carrying at the time he was killed. 2 of Brown's sons are also killed around this point, Oliver and Watson Brown. Oliver is shot in the stomach. He's laying on the floor just inside the door of the engine house. He's bleeding out. He's crying out. Brown kind of snarls at his son there that, if you're going to die, die like a man. Civilian casualties are mounting here. The mayor, the baggage master, several others. Like we said, the bars in town are continuing to serve alcohol. Things get really ugly at this point. Dangerfield Newby's body is desecrated by souvenir hunters. Parts of his body are cut off as souvenirs. He's beaten. He is shot at point-blank range. Hogs end up nearly devouring his corpse. Others of Brown's men, like William Thompson, who you see here, this was a brother to one of Brown's sons-in-law, he was effectively executed by angry militia and civilians in Harper's Ferry. His body used as target practice. Late on the night of October 17th, a force of 90 United States Marines arrived from the Washington Navy Yard. They're led by Colonel Robert E. Lee and a young Lieutenant Jeb Stuart, later a famous Confederate cavalryman. Lee, of course, leads the Army of Northern Virginia during the Civil War. Lee is worried about a nighttime assault on the engine house. He thinks, this could be deadly not only for the Marines, but for the hostages that are stuck there in the engine house with Brown. So he opts to wait until the following morning. So at 7 a.m. on October 18th, Jeb Stuart goes forward to Brown with one final offer to surrender. Brown is continuing to try to negotiate his way out of town at this point. Stuart says, I can't accept any terms other than your immediate surrender. So Stuart steps aside, he waves his hat, and the militia begin, that's a designated signal, and the Marines begin their assault on the engine house. They try to batter the engine house door with sledgehammers. They're unsuccessful here. These were big, heavy doors. They notice a large ladder laying nearby in the armory yard. So they pick up the ladder. They use it as a battering ram. On the second attempt, a small hole opens in the bottom of one of the doors. Several minutes later, several Marines crawl through this hole in the door. They find their hostages. Hostages point out, there's Brown. That's the man you're looking for. Brown is badly wounded in this final assault. After 36 hours of John Brown's raid, it took less than 3 minutes for the Marines to subdue Brown and his men. Several more of Brown's men are killed in this final assault on the engine house, as is one United States Marine. In all, 10 of Brown's men were killed, including Dangerfield Newby from Bridgeport. 5 escaped from Harper's Ferry, and 7, including John Brown, are captured. That night, the Baltimore and Ohio offices in Baltimore wired a wheeling that the insurrection has been suppressed and that all trains should begin running their regular schedule. Now, Brown realizes that where his raid had failed, perhaps he still might win, but rather from a bully pulpit. So here's where Brown shapes much of how we know him and understand him today. You know, these final 6 weeks of his life might be his most significant, most impactful. Get a drink before my voice starts going. Now, Brown is removed to nearby Charlestown. He's put on trial, lasts only about a week. Brown and his compatriots are tried, convicted, and sentenced to death on the counts of murder, treason, and inciting insurrection. Brown was offered the opportunity to speak at his trial, at the conclusion of his trial, and his speech is now famous. Some historians compare it to the Gettysburg Address. Brown says that, quote, "If it's deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, I say, let it be done." As much as the raid itself, this trial brought the United States even closer to civil war. This was the first trial in the United States to receive exhaustive newspaper coverage. It forced people to choose sides on the issue of slavery. Here's a white man who was willing to die for the slaves. So Brown even in death, he is reducing the margins of neutrality. People who thought that they weren't involved with slavery at all, who had been ambivalent about slavery, now realize that it's time to choose sides here. Speaking of newspapers, all of our local newspapers all over the country, including locally, reported on John Brown, on the raid, on the trial, on the fallout. If you think the news media is bad today, they were hyper-partisan in 1859. Each of these, all of the newspapers reported with their own spin, their own bias. So the Daily Intelligencer was the loudest Republican newspaper in the state of Virginia, bemoaned that, quote, Brown was, quote, "a man of so much frankness, so much high personal courage, so much magnanimity, was intended for a much more honorable end than the gallows." Now, the Wheeling Union, which was a Democratic or pro-Southern newspaper, after the events at Harper's Ferry, dedicated itself to, quote, "resisting the aggression of the North." The editor reported that the, quote, "events are ripening when the North becomes, as the signs indicate it will soon become, an engine of oppression, injury, and wrong, and the South will take her own destinies in her hands." The Belmont Chronicle was a Republican newspaper printed in St. Clairsville, reported that, quote, "it is hoped the Virginia chivalry will glut their greed of abolition blood after Brown's execution, and that the Virginians were acting with, quote, such savage, cannibalistic greediness." The Caddis Republican printed a letter that, quote, "John Brown has been murdered by the whole available force of Virginia. Ain't the thought sickening that the mother of presidents should come to this?" The Caddis Democratic Sentinel reported on notorious, quote, "John Brown Republicans" who were observing the time of Brown's death in the county. And it's the same story all throughout the United States, all throughout the Ohio Valley, Steubenville, Wellsburg, exhaustive editorials and coverage of what was going on. It shows you just how divided the population of the United States is becoming in 1859, as well as here locally. So Brown had only 1 month left to live after the trial. His execution date is set for December 2nd, 1859. And from his jail cell, he continues to preach the motives of his life, the immediate abolition of slavery. And during this month, he starts to garner more support throughout the North. Now, there were something like 2,000 troops, or Virginia militia, who were present in Charlestown on hand for Brown's execution. And that seems like, a little bit of overkill, don't you think? But part of the reason was fear that abolitionists from Ohio and points north would descend on Charlestown and try to free John Brown. So Henry Wise, the governor of Virginia, he'd been receiving letters since the raid about plots plots and schemes from abolitionists to liberate John Brown, to incite further slave insurrections. One of those letters came from locally. It was written by a guy from Mount Pleasant, Ohio, my hometown, written to Governor Wise, stating that he had been made aware of plans being made locally in Mount Pleasant and Steubenville and West Middletown to effect a rescue of John Brown. Now, tensions were raw. So, these were the letters that were placed on the desk of President Buchanan saying, we need troops here to ensure that we are able to carry through with this execution. But, tensions were raw. People who looked out of place here in Wheeling, in Benwood, in Moundsville, they were being detained. Their property was being searched. Armed men were placed along the Ohio River at Wheeling and at Benwood to ensure that no armed abolitionists were crossing over the river. In the immediate days leading up to the execution, John B. Ford, who was the station agent for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad here in Wheeling, he gets an order that's instructing that all males traveling from Wheeling, Benwood, and Moundsville in the direction of Harper's Ferry must bear a written certificate from Ford stating that he knows them and that they are traveling on legitimate business. And Ford is to allow only 60 men during that period come from Wheeling to points east. So they are really clamping down on travel, anyone who could be coming in the direction from Ohio. Two companies of Wheeling militia, the Virginia Fencibles and the Wheeling Rifles, are dispatched to Charlestown to be present for the execution. They were the only militia from this area of Western Virginia at that time, to make the trip to be present there, traveling more than 200 miles. Their ranks included a prominent Wheeling names like Charles W. Russell, who was a prominent attorney in town, later served for several years in the Confederate Congress in Richmond. Joseph Pendleton, another Wheeling attorney who later served as an officer in the Stonewall Brigade, also present with the Fencibles. And you can see that's George Trimble there, wearing the uniform of the Wheeling Fencibles, the same uniform they would have been wearing at the execution. But also present with the Fencibles was one of my ancestors, a guy by the name of George Ellerick. So during the course of my research, I had no idea about George Ellerick or that he had ever served in the Fencibles. But these militiamen, were paid by the state of Virginia for their services during John Brown's raid. And so in the course of researching for the book, I ordered the payrolls from the Library of Virginia for these Wheeling companies, and I found my ancestor's name there, showing that he was paid as having been present at Brown's execution. So the Wheeling militia arrive at Harper's Ferry on November 28th. They examine, the fire engine house and the sites in town, kind of sightseeing. One of the men recalled that, quote, "We drilled some and drank more." In Charlestown, they're quartered at the Zion Episcopal Church. It's still there today. These guys were sleeping on church pews during the week they were there. The Wheeling men were, quote, "overflowing with patriotic love for the Old Dominion and for old rye whiskey." On December 1st, the Fencibles serve as an escort for John Brown's wife, Mary Brown, who visited her husband in his jail cell on the evening prior to his execution. Here you see John Brown on the wagon that's carrying him to the gallows, and these are the Virginia Fencibles over here. You can see the uniform matches pretty well with the uniform of George Trimble there. So on the morning of December 2nd, Brown is led from his jail cell to a waiting wagon to carry him to the execution site. As he's ascending the gallows, cities around the north are marking the time. Church bells are ringing, shops are closing at this hour when Brown was going to dangle from a rope and be no more. Church bells chimed locally here, and we know that they were ringing in Cadiz, Ohio. We have an account of that. But the Fencibles, they serve as an escort for Brown on the way to the gallows. On reaching the gallows, the Fencibles are assigned a position of honor. They are placed 10 yards in front of the gallows. They had a front row seat for this morbid spectacle here. So you can see right down here are your men from Wheeling right in front of the gallows. Virginia's governor, Henry Wise, he knew that Republicans were perhaps louder here in Wheeling than anywhere else in the state. So he wrote that he was elated that Wheeling had, quote, "shown her truth to Virginia and that he was proud of the corps that she had sent to prove it." Also of interest, one of these men in the fencibles here, one of the guys from Wheeling, was apparently one of the last survivors to witness John Brown's execution. John Wilson Orr, he was originally from Wheeling. He died in Pittsburgh in 1904, but there's a 1903 newspaper article I found where he claims that he was the last survivor to have witnessed the execution. That's only 44 years after Brown's execution. I think his claim is a little dubious, especially considering my ancestor who was there lived until 1917. But on his way to the gallows, Brown hands his jailer a note. It's become famous today, reading, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done." Of course, blood had been spilled at Harper's Ferry at the expense of John Brown and his men, and now on December 2nd, Brown's blood was being spilled at his execution. His body is transported north to his family farm at North Elba, New York. Crowds are waiting at each rail stop to view his body. He is sent north with the noose still hanging around his neck. He had achieved something of a martyr status at this point in the North, where Southerners, of course, viewed John Brown as a terrorist who represented the very worst of abolition fanaticism and aggression in the North. Brown is extolled in poem and verse. Herman Melville calls Brown the meteor of the war. Meteors at that time were thought to predict something great happening. If you saw a meteor, it supposedly meant something great, incredible was going to happen very soon after. So they called Brown the meteor of the war. Frederick Douglass proclaimed that the very first shots of the Civil War were not fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in April 1861, but rather they were fired at Harper's Ferry by John Brown in October 1859. But what if I told you that those first shots of the Civil War came very near happening right here in the Ohio Valley, right along the Ohio River? Well, Virginia Governor Henry Wise, he began urging Virginia citizens after the raid to, quote, organize and take arms in their hands and practice the use of arms. And he promised to establish depots for fixed ammunition all along the length of Virginia's border. In November 1859, so 1 month after the raid, Governor Wise informs the governors of Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, those states immediately bordering Virginia, that he meant to preserve peace along Virginia's borders, even if it meant pursuing invaders from Virginia into their jurisdictions. 5 of Brown's men escaped from Harper's Ferry through Maryland into Pennsylvania, and several of them go west to Ohio. So, Maryland and Pennsylvania, they say, absolutely, do what you need to do to preserve peace. But Ohio Governor Salmon P. Chase cautioned Wise that the laws of Ohio, quote, cannot consent to the invasion of her territory by armed bodies from other states, even for the purpose of pursuing and arresting fugitives from justice. Henry Wise is furious at this point. He calls on the Virginia legislature to arm the border of Virginia from Point of Rocks over around Frederick, Maryland, all the way to Wheeling. In response, the legislature increases militia spending by nearly $500,000 for 1860. That is nearly $19 million adjusted for today's inflation. So Wise begins spending that money right here, locally. In early December 1859, brass cannon begin arriving along the Ohio River. They're deposited at places like Wheeling, at Sistersville, Parkersburg, Point Pleasant, and Guyandotte, all of them aiming across the Ohio River at Ohio. Additional arms were sent to the militia companies in Hancock and Brooke counties and all along the Ohio River. It was really starting to look like interstate warfare was going to touch off right here. Ohio poked more fun at this. They fixed wheels to milk churns and they pointed them at the Virginia shore, kind of poking fun at Virginia. It's funny that in 1861, with the outbreak of the Civil War, all of those cannon that Wise had deposited here were captured by federal troops. They were turned around and they were pointed at Virginia. But William Dennison, Ohio's governor in 1861, he sounds a lot more like Governor Henry Wise, when in 1861 he was anxious to defend Ohio, where he said, quote, where it costs less and accomplishes more beyond rather than on Ohio's border, as he urged George McClellan to advance from Wheeling and Marietta into Virginia. So, some people will write off John Brown as a fanatic, as a terrorist, maybe that he was even mentally ill. Whatever you think of him, and I'm not here to change any hearts or minds, but John Brown was also prophetically accurate. In 1 year, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. Southern states secede from the Union, and over the resulting 4 years, the country would see nearly 750,000 deaths before slavery was finally purged away. But with those shots fired during the 36 hours at Harper's Ferry, with the shots fired from the courtroom, with the shots fired from his jail cell over the final 6 weeks of his life, John Brown truly was the meteor of the Civil War. So I do have a few copies of my book here. I wrote this book in 2020 while I was losing my mind, sitting at home during the pandemic. Needed something to take my mind off of it, so I wrote this book with my good friend Kevin Pollack. We're on to our second printing now, but we've got, just kind of like I did here, but in much more detail. We take John Brown from the cradle to the grave, all the run up to Harper's Ferry, the events of the raid, the trial, the execution, the fallout, the legacy. We've got a walking tour in there of sites in Lowertown, Harper's Ferry, so I hope all of you avail yourselves of an opportunity to visit Harper's Ferry. It's an amazing place, but there's a guide there that will take you around the surviving sites still there in Lowertown. There's a driving tour that will take you from the Kennedy Farmhouse in Maryland to Charlestown, to the courthouse, to the jail site, to the execution site, and many places in between. So I thank you for having me back. This is the last John Brown raid talk you'll hear from me. I promise you that, because it's the second one. But if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Are there descendants of John Brown?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, Brown had 20 children. I think that's between 2 different wives. I don't know how he had time for all this, anti-slavery stuff. I have 2 kids, and they take up all my time. I think 11 of them survived to adulthood. Many of the Browns, after John Brown's raid, after the Civil War, they moved west out to California. And so they situate themselves out there, but many descendants of the children of John Brown. And like I said, Annie Brown, she's the one. Some of the children, they don't want to talk much about their father. They don't want to be associated with that. Annie Brown really remains her father's fiercest defender. She won't hear a bad word said about him. I really like Annie Brown. She's worthy of a whole program on herself. But she had a really rough life. Her husband was an alcoholic. The family was perpetually broke. They had to rely on donations from her father's admirers to get by. So fascinating lady who lived a really tough existence.
Another question, I'm not shy. The 5, was it 5 who escaped, or 5 or 7 who escaped, do we know anything more about them, and did they continue the effort to abolish slavery?
Yes, several of them fought in the Civil War. Several of them died in the Civil War. But let's see who else. I think one might have ended up in Canada for briefly. So after John Brown's raid, Brown had some financial backers and kind of prominent guys in abolitionist circles, but also guys with money who would help sustain Brown's activities. And after the raid, they were known as the Secret Six. And after the raid, these guys kind of scattered to the winds. One of them ends up in an insane asylum for a brief period. Another goes to Europe. One goes to Canada. So they kind of scatter there. But yes, several of these men later end up fighting in the Civil War. One who was from Salem, Ohio, he ends up going west out to Iowa. He dies in a train wreck in late 1861 or early 1862 in Iowa. Another dies in North Carolina. He's buried in the National Cemetery down there, I believe. So they all still kind of continued that fight for freedom. And for Dangerfield Newby here, our strongest local connection, several of his brothers went on to fight in the Civil War, enlisting right here in Wheeling. One of them was mortally wounded in one of the early assaults at the Battle of Petersburg, and he dies in a hospital at Governor's Island, New York. So, all of these families kind of, continue that effort for freedom, for equality during and after the Civil War.
John, hearing the numbers of 21 or however many had, looking at the situation, not understanding fully, it sounds like a really not a real good plan, although it started out well. Did people, did I remember Frederick Douglass, did others try to talk him out of it? Frederick Douglass, didn't he have a talking turkey with John Brown at some point?
Brown had hoped Frederick Douglass would join with him. He was a big fan of Frederick Douglass. Douglass is, ultimately a very prominent abolitionist during that time. So Brown was encouraging Douglass to join him. He said, when the bees start to swarm, Douglass, when the slaves start to rally to me, I need you to help gather them. Douglass gives us his account of their meeting later in life. He's got some benefit of hindsight. So Douglass tells us that he tried to talk Brown out of this attack on Harper's Ferry, that he called Harper's Ferry something like a perfect steel trap, and that once he got down there, Brown would be captured, that there was no way for this plan to work. And so Douglass did not join. Brown had hoped for Harriet Tubman to join him as well. He wrote to Tubman, did not hear back from her. So he was disappointed that these individuals, these names, these personas wouldn't come and help him with this. He met Douglass in Chambersburg, and I think it was August 1859. And while Douglass opted not to join with Brown, the gentleman who was with Douglass, a guy by the name of Shields Green, an escaped slave, did decide to join with Brown. He tells Douglass famingly, I think I'll go with the old man. And he joins with Brown. And ultimately, I think he ends up regretting his decision. He says, I worked so hard to get out of the grips of slavery, and now I found myself right back in it. And Green was executed as well after John Brown's execution. So, yeah, he tried to get Douglass into it, and Douglass leaves us a great account. He was speaking at, I think it was a Storer College graduation, maybe in the 1880s, and he leaves us the account of his meeting with John Brown. So he's got a little bit of hindsight.
Was the execution by hanging, a drop to break his neck, or was it strangulation?
Yeah, it did. It snapped his neck.
Okay.
He didn't linger.
Yeah, they used to just let him strangle, and if you gave the executioner a couple coins, he'd pull on your feet and make it shorter.
Yeah, he went right down. It snapped his neck, and like I said, they delivered him. So that his wife was not allowed to be present. She was not allowed to stay in the jail cell with him. She was not allowed to be present. She had to go back and wait at Harper's Ferry. They delivered his body back to her in a casket with the noose still around his neck, and that is how he made his way home. At rail stops, all kinds of crowds seeing him, and that was one of the lasting images. I think there's actually a charcoal sketch or an engraving of Brown with the noose around his neck, and that was one of the images that evoked such strong emotions out of people who saw him.
Do you think he ever considered just raiding the armory, taking the weapons and the bullets and just leaving versus trying to stay there and defend it?
That's a discussion amongst historians. I'm not sure John Brown actually wanted all of those weapons. Brown had a cache of weapons. He had superior weapons. He had Sharp's rifles that he had secured prior to the raid. He had pikes that he planned to arm some of the escaped slaves with. These pikes are one of the most recognizable features of John Brown's raid. But he had a big stash of weapons. He had them stored at the Kennedy farmhouse. He left several men there to guard them. And then during the raid, they were supposed to bring them to a forward point, a schoolhouse closer to Harper's Ferry, where he would send men back across the river to be armed. There is no indication that during John Brown's raid that he made any attempt while he was there to unload all of these weapons. He came into town on a wagon. There were no weapons in this wagon. The men weren't pilfering the weapons. I'm not sure how interested he was in them. He had a superior gun. He was not, Brown was anticipating, having some of these slaves rally to him at Harper's Ferry, being able to make it back across the river, that the women, the children, the elderly, that he would funnel them north, but the fit men that he would keep with him to fight in small squads, that he could fortify different points in the mountain, and from there, continue to gather up slaves, exchange hostages. But I'm not sure how interested he actually was in the weapons. He didn't make any attempt to take any. And a lot of people disagree about that. That's just my opinion. Some other historians feel the same way, but there's a lot of people who think that his entire goal for being there was that armory with 100,000 weapons. But it was also kind of thumbing his nose at the Buchanan administration. There was, I can't remember the exact total, but there was a bounty that was placed on Brown's head at one point, and if it was, say it was $500 or something, and Brown said that he would offer a 50-cent bounty on the head of President Buchanan. So this was a federal installation. This was a black eye for the Buchanan administration, and so that's another part of the reason I think why he landed there. And also, I'm sorry to keep going. We're at 1 o'clock here. There was an armory in Missouri that had been raided by a pro-slavery posse in December of 1855. They took that posse took guns, they took cannon, they took harnesses, holsters, and they took it to Kansas with intention to use it against the free soil settlers who were there. Those men were required to bring that stuff back to that armory at one point, but they were not punished whatsoever. And so Brown saw this as perhaps this might work. Here we have a pro-slavery group who is looting arms and ammunition from this federal installation out here. Maybe he was trying to replicate that. He doesn't tell us that he was, but he certainly would have known about it at that time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jon-Erik.